So we called this talk Finding Light in Dark Archives because we felt that the archive we work with is sort of partially open but not really very accessible to users. And I think this is one of these issues around email archives that I'm sure everybody here is very familiar with. In the background, you can see Microsoft Outlook 98. So quite a bit of our emails would have been sent in that environment. So they are around 20 years old. If there were normal archives, they would right now be more or less released to researchers. Obviously, there are lots of issues with email archives, so many of these email archives that exist from that time period are effectively dark archives. So our research is really focused on trying to think about what if we get access to these resources, what would we actually do with them? Because I think that's an interesting question for researchers. So we're trying to come at the problem from the perspective of people wanting to use those resources. And to this end, we're working with some AI tools. So Shanti's going to tell us a little bit more about those later on after I introduce the project and what our assumptions are. Because she's really the person who knows the technical side, and so we're wider collaboration. I think a couple of people were already introduced earlier on the call, but essentially we received funding from the AHRC for this year, next year, for a US-UK collaboration. So we're US and UK universities and also archives in the UK and the US. If you want any more information on our project, we have a little sort of presentation of the project because we felt there's not really enough time for that. So you can follow this link on YouTube, and I think somebody at the end of this, I'll post it in the chat, or maybe somebody else can do that. So what are we doing in our project? Essentially, what we're interested in is really the gap between what is currently being done to preserve emails, and there's quite a lot of activity around that. So present day archives, I think there's a lot more happening on email that will make them accessible in the future. But we are also wondering about the email archives like the one we're working with, which should be accessible now, but are not, because there are lots of problems with using them. There are not really any tools available at the moment to use them effectively. And as we already heard, access is just such a thorny issue that it's very difficult to engage with. And this threaded nature of emails, they just make them very different from the correspondence that we find in paper archives, and we'll be able to use them differently as a result, but it also causes some problems in terms of how, as researchers, would we actually engage with these new resources. So the email archive we specifically work with is called Avocado IT. That's not its real name. So for all sorts of data protection issues, this is a company that once upon a time was very successful, but ultimately failed. One of the dot-com boom companies, which of course by now is also a historical event, and this is a resource that has really great potential to give us further insight into how these companies grew, became successful, and then failed, often in quite rapid succession. It is partly available through the Linguistic Data Consortium, but I'm sure many of you are aware that Linguistic Data Consortium is a type of research often known as non-consumptive. So it's not the kind of research where people would actually go and read an email and have a sense of the content. It's much more about the structural elements or the wording in those emails. So we wanted to really look at different ways of exploring email archives for search and study, where we are still interested in the content. What are people actually saying to each other in these emails, without necessarily giving up on what are the relational, the network properties of the format, because as we heard before, reading an individual email isn't terribly meaningful. You need to understand the context, and hence the context notion in the title, that we think email are a different kind of source that people will be able to access, of require new tools and different ways of engaging with it. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Shanti, who's going to explain to you on the technical side how we are working on resolving that issue.
Thank you, Stephanie. Being the first to do this kind of research, we took the liberty to define context for emails. The context is the combination of who, what, and when, as shown in this diagram. Who is the sender and or recipient? What represents the event, and when is the time instance? So who, what, and when are the interdependent entities of the email. what this arrangement gives us. This arrangement allows us to model email corpus data ready for machine learning algorithms in order to extract the content. Can I have the next slide? So here we have developed two models for contextualization, and the effectiveness of these models are compared to the existing keyword search. So let me explain that with an example. Let us suppose a user has a search query, something like e-business trends during 2001 and 2002. So here any normal human being understands the information what he wants, but the existing keyword search might split is not might the existing keyword search is in such a works in such a way it splits the words within the query and provide us the results with e-business trends 2001 and 2002, some numbers 2001 and 2002, all those mails that we may get as a search result. So here we have got two models. The model one is phrase matching. Using the phrase matching, it is possible to extract the phrase that is something like e-business trends, matching other all those emails that contain these words, or if we are lucky, even e-business trends 2001 and 2002 together. The next model is a bit more complex, that is the attention-based content encoding. Aside from these complex words, it is what it does is it understands the meaning and gives similar mails as a result. That is something like we can see in the example. It might give us smart market trends or online market exploration or maybe even business collaborations. So these are all the probabilistic in a probabilistic way, they are similar to the query, and we get the ranked order of the mails. So these are the two models that we have developed, and I would like to explain more when we get the time. Stephanie.
Thanks, Shanti. We were asked to come up with some provocations, and we had a discussion as a team and thought we actually have two provocations in terms of some of the work that exists around email archives. So our first provocation is really this focus that we started out with, which is this idea of should we maybe be starting with how researchers want to use email archives, both now and also in the future, rather than just looking at preservation. And we completely agree preservation is extremely important, but it's also a question of what is it that we're preserving. And there was obviously an excellent blog I'm sure you're all familiar with, highlighting that access is what we're preserving. There are different types of users out there. And we've been trying to think about how would people who normally go to archives, people who might be more interested in a qualitative research query rather than necessarily in a large data collection drive or data analysis project, how would they want to ask questions? And that's really what Shanti was just presenting. You'd have a sort of conceptual query and you would try to translate that over into what can I find in this resource. And we're also really thinking that a lot of the research that might happen in email archives, specifically at the beginning, might really be in email archives that are not that consistently maintained, because this focus on preservation is not really quite, hasn't been the same for, let's say, 2000, 2001. So the email archives we're looking at the moment. And some of them, quite frankly, are basically data dumps. They are not very structured. They're not very well maintained. They come in all sorts of formats. So how can you still actually work with them? And I should say that David, who's part of our project, has done an enormous amount of work around saving some of these archives. And this is how we got to Avocado IT, where companies fail and these archives are rescued essentially. They're not obviously maintained or preserved in quite the same way. And there may be, and we know there are more archives like this out there. So for us, really, we're looking at these as, network analysis and topic modeling, while they're very interesting, that do not represent all the possible research uses that people will want to make of email archives right now or in the future. They are, however, also very valuable in understanding the context. But we're really also, in our provocation, want to highlight the historians, journalists, cultural studies, qualitative social scientists who will want to research these resources with an interest in the content and not just the contextual features or the metadata of an email archive, but they will want to know what people said to each other and what that reveals about the organization, its decision making, the concerns, the cultural attitudes being held, and that this is also important data, and we need to think about tools to make these accessible, these resources. Our second provocation then is that a lot of email archives are not just individual, but also organizational. And obviously Jessica already presented on also an organizational archive. They're probably a little bit rarer. A lot of the resources on EPAD are very much individual archives. And that means these resources are not just one custodian and their email archives, which is, let's face it, complicated enough in most cases. It's often that you have organizational custodians where an email address may reflect a function in an organization and not just individuals, or multiple individuals might be writing from the same email. Think about help desk, for example. You wouldn't necessarily have individual and custodian be the same thing in that case. What we also found with our email archive is many of them are multilingual, particularly American email archives contain a lot of Spanish, which seems obvious, but we hadn't actually thought about it until we did a search and realized, oh my God, there's a whole body of emails in here that are Spanish. So a lot of these resources, I think when they're organizational, if you had a large multinational, that would really be much, much bigger a problem, because you'd have not just two world languages, but probably significantly more. The other aspect here is really the email archive we work with derives from a failed organization, and that's very much the opposite of most organizational archives we currently hold. Now, that might just be incidental in our case, but we suspect quite a lot of the dark email archives out there are probably from failed organizations, and that potentially also changes the nature of what the historical records in the future will be like. But we're also interested really in how the sort of content and context interact. So email patterns obviously reflect organizational processes in really meaningful ways. Email allows us to actually work with that and pull that into our analysis. It reflects hierarchies, but also social capital of individual members, so that sort of not everything will be explained by a formal structure. So again, we're interested here in not just in network analysis, but really where that would make the context become content and change our understanding of the content. So those are our two provocations. I think I'll leave it here in the interest of time.
Great. Thank you to both, all four of our presenters. Really exciting work.